On a cold Victorian Christmas Eve, families didn't just share presents and pudding, they invited ghosts to the fire. By the light of real candles and crackling logs, parents and children leaned in close to hear stories of footsteps on empty staircases and pale faces at the window. Long before Halloween took over the spooky season, Christmas was the night for ghost stories. Tonight we're going back to that parlor of flickering light and swirling fog to listen for the ghosts the Victorians expected to appear at Christmas. Welcome to a quiet moment wrapped in candlelight history. I am Amadeo Francis Hawthorne, your humble guide and storyteller. Tonight we wander together into the forgotten corners of the past. But first, if you don't mind, whisper in the comments where you're listening from and at what hour your candle burns tonight. In our modern world, Christmas usually means warm lights, busy shops, and cozy films where everything ends happily ever after. But in Victorian Britain, the season also belonged to the dark, to long nights, deep fog, and the feeling that the veil between the living and the dead had grown very thin. After the feast was eaten and the carols were sung, there came a quieter hour. The lamps were turned low, the house fell still, and families gathered around the fire to share tales of haunted rectories, lonely moors, and restless spirits who chose Christmas Eve to return. In this story, Ghosts by the Christmas Fire, we'll slip into one small Victorian parlor on a foggy December night. To watch the tree candles flicker, feel the warmth of the hearth, and listen as a simple family joins a lost tradition. Telling ghost stories on Christmas to remember the dead and to feel a beautiful little shiver in the safety of the firelight. My friends, let us begin now. With Chapter 1, A Parlor Wrapped in Fog. Imagine yourself stepping just for a moment into a Victorian street on Christmas Eve. The air is damp and cold, thick with the smell of coal smoke. Gas lamps burn in a line along the road, little islands of yellow light swimming in a sea of gray. You pass shop windows, some still faintly glowing, toys, books, and sweets half hidden behind a misted layer of glass. But our destination tonight is not a grand department store or a palace. It is a simple terraced house, 3 floors high, with narrow steps leading up to a painted door. Behind that door, a family has gathered. We slip quietly inside. The hallway is dim. A hat stand leans in the corner, heavy with cloaks and shawls still dusted with fog. On a small table, a few Christmas cards are propped up, their colored pictures of robins, snow, and holly leaves carefully arranged. From the parlor ahead, we hear the soft murmur of voices and the crackle of a healthy fire. We move closer. Someone pulls the parlor door almost shut behind us, and the rest of the house falls away into shadow. Inside the room, the center of everything is the hearth. Logs burn steadily, throwing out that fierce, thirsty heat that only real flame can give. Above the mantel, a small Christmas tree stands proudly, its dark branches decorated with paper ornaments, strings of popcorn, perhaps a few sugared fruits and tiny candles fixed in metal clips. The candles on the tree will not burn for long. They are beautiful and dangerous. But for now, their little flames mirror the fire below, doubling the glow in the room. Around the hearth are gathered the people who live in this house. A father, perhaps, tired from work but content, shoes off, feet stretched towards the fire. A mother, with a dress a little more worn than she'd like, but eyes soft as she looks at her children, hands resting in her lap now that the meal is over. The children themselves, still humming the tune of the last carol, fingers sticky from pudding and the rare treat of oranges. Maybe there is an aunt visiting or a widowed uncle. In Victorian stories, there is almost always someone who knows just the right tale to tell. The plates have been cleared away. The last embers of conversation about presents and neighbors are fading. The house beyond this room is quieting into sleep, bedrooms cooling, stairs creaking once as someone climbs them, then falling still. Here in the parlor, though, no one is ready for bed. This is a different kind of hour. The children draw closer to the fire, wrapping themselves in a shared blanket on the rug. An older child nudges the youngest a little nearer to the center, where it is safer and warmer. On the little table by the window, someone lowers the lamp. The shadows grow deeper. The Christmas tree candles burn more brightly in the relative dark. Outside the glass, the fog presses close. It blurs the shapes of other houses and makes the street lamp opposite look like a floating star. Inside, the family can no longer see much of the world beyond. They see only their own reflections faintly superimposed on the night. The fire, the tree, the faces of the people they love, and the long, breathing dark just outside the window. This is the moment when a ghost story feels right. Not to curse the day or to chase away Christmas joy, but to acknowledge that winter is a time of endings and beginnings, of long nights, old memories, and the soft sense that those we have lost might be nearer than usual. In this parlor, and in countless others across Victorian Britain, someone clears their throat, leans a little closer to the fire, and begins. The first words of a Christmas ghost story. My friends, now we turn to Chapter 2. Why Christmas Belonged to Ghosts. Remember our little Victorian parlor, the one wrapped in fog with the fire burning low and the Christmas tree candles trembling on their branches. Before the storyteller begins, let's step sideways for a moment and ask a simple question. Why did Christmas of all nights belong to ghosts? In our modern world, we often think of Christmas as bright and loud, full of electric lights, busy streets, and jingling music in every shop. But for the Victorians, and for many peoples long before them, this time of year was first and foremost about something much older. The deepest part of winter. The days were short. The nights were long, so long that it could feel as if the world itself had grown tired of waking. Imagine a countryside with no streetlights at all. When the sun slipped away in the afternoon, darkness did not politely wait on the horizon. It poured in. Fields vanished into shadow. Church towers became black shapes against a low sky. Roads and footpaths became thin, uncertain lines between one island of firelight and the next. For centuries, people in many lands marked this dark turning of the year, the days around the winter solstice, with fire, feasts, and story. It was a time when life and death felt particularly close together. The last harvest was in the barn, or not. Animals were slaughtered for winter meat. Plants seemed dead in the ground, and the cold reminded everyone how fragile a human body could be. In this thin, uncertain season, many believed that spirits, the souls of the dead, or other stranger beings, were more likely to wander. Even as Christianity grew and older beliefs faded, the sense that winter nights were haunted did not disappear. It simply moved to a new address. By the time we reach the Victorian era, Christmas has settled firmly over these midwinter days. It is a celebration of light, of the birth of hope, of families gathered together around tables and hearths. But the dark outside the window and the old fears that lived in it have not gone away. They had trains, chimneys, factories, and telegraphs, astonishing inventions that could shrink distances and change lives. But they also had gas lamps that flickered and hissed, coal smoke that turned fog into something almost solid, and night journeys on unlit roads through fields and graveyards that looked exactly as they had for hundreds of years. Death, too, felt closer to everyday life than it does for many of us now. Illnesses we can now treat were often final. Mothers might lose children. Children might lose parents. Families wore mourning clothes, kept hair lockets and portraits, and spoke often of those who had gone before. It is not surprising, then, that a season about family, memory, and the hope of life beyond death might also become a season for stories about ghosts. In many Victorian homes, telling ghost stories at Christmas was a way of standing at the edge of the dark without stepping into it. You could sit by a safe, bright fire with people you loved on every side and invite the idea of fear to come and sit in the empty chair just for a little while. A story of a haunted house, a restless spirit, or a warning from beyond the grave could make hearts beat faster and then slower as everyone remembered that they themselves were warm, safe, and alive. In this way, Christmas ghost stories were not just about frightening listeners. They were also about gratitude. Gratitude for the roof overhead, for the food on the table, for the faces gathered in the light, and for the chance for one more winter to be among them. Some stories, like the famous one about a miserly old man visited by spirits on Christmas Eve, even use ghosts to teach compassion. In those tales, the dead do not appear just to rattle chains, but to remind the living to be kinder, more generous, more aware of time slipping past. So when our own storyteller in that foggy Victorian parlor leans towards the fire and begins a ghost story, they are taking part in a much older pattern, using the chill and mystery of the winter night to make the warmth of the room feel even deeper. They are, in a way, inviting the dark to sit politely at the edge of the circle, acknowledged but not in control. And so, after this little pause to understand why Christmas once belonged to ghosts, we can return to our own waiting parlor, to the hush, the fog at the window, and the listening faces around the hearth. Because the story they are about to hear is ready to begin. My friends, now we turn to Chapter 3, Gathering by the Fire. Remember our little parlor, the one wrapped in fog with the tree candles trembling and the fire burning low. We return there now. The plates from supper are gone. The last crumbs of pudding have disappeared from the children's fingers. An extra log has been placed on the fire, and for a moment the room flares brighter, flames leaping up the chimney before settling again into a steady glow. The family shifts into the positions they know so well for evenings like this. The youngest child is quietly drawn a little closer to the center of the rug, where the heat is gentler and the shadows are softer. An older sister wraps the blanket around both of their shoulders, tucking in the edges with practiced hands. Their mother folds her arms loosely, not in impatience, but in that way people do when their work is finally done for the day. Their father leans back just enough that the firelight catches one side of his face and leaves the other in shadow. Near the hearth, in a well-worn armchair, sits the person everyone has been quietly waiting for. Perhaps it is an aunt who has come to stay from the country. Perhaps a grandfather with a voice like old paper and a talent for making even simple stories sound mysterious. Whoever they are, the room seems to lean towards them. They sit with one elbow resting lightly on the chair's arm, fingers touching their cheek, eyes half on the fire and half on the faces around them. On the small table at their side lies a thin book, not a grand volume, just a modest collection of tales and sketches. For a while, no one speaks. The only sounds are the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel, the occasional shift of coal and wood in the grate, and, if you listen very carefully, the quiet breathing of the children on the rug. Finally, with a small sigh that is half contentment and half performance, the storyteller straightens in the chair. Their hand closes gently around the edge of the little book, but they do not open it yet. Instead, they look slowly around the room. At the father, whose eyes are already brighter with anticipation. At the mother, who smiles faintly while pretending to busy her hands with her skirt. At the children who have fallen into perfect stillness, only their eyes moving, shining in the firelight. And so, the storyteller says at last, their voice low and even. On a night very much like this one. A little shiver runs through the youngest child. They are not quite sure why. Perhaps it is the words. Perhaps it is the way the shadows on the wall seem to lean a little closer, as if the room itself is listening. On a night very like this, the storyteller repeats, when the fog lay thick over the fields and the church bells were muffled in the air. There was a small house standing alone at the edge of a village. As they speak, they do open the book, but only to rest it upon their knee, as if this story is one they know by heart. It was not so different from our own house, they continue gently, but it did have one curious companion. A lane that ran past its door straight to the churchyard, where the stones stood close together like people whispering in the dark. The older child glances just once towards the covered window, knowing very well that their own house also stands near a lane, and that there is, not so very far away, a churchyard of their own. The storyteller sees the glance, and their eyes soften. This is only a story, their look says, without needing words. But it is the kind of story that likes to visit places that feel familiar. They say, the storyteller goes on, that in that little house. This is only a story, their look says, without needing words. But it is the kind of story that likes to visit places that feel familiar. They say, the storyteller goes on, that in that little house. On a certain Christmas Eve, someone heard a sound at the window after the hour when callers should have gone home. A soft tap, they say. Not the sharp knock of a visitor's hand, but the faint, uncertain touch of something that was not altogether sure it wished to come in. In our parlor, a small hand tightens on the edge of the blanket. The storyteller's voice remains calm and even, almost soothing, as they describe the sound and the way it must have felt to hear it in a quiet house on a winter night. No one was expected, they say. The hour was late, and the fog lay so thick upon the lane that even a church tower had vanished into the dark. Yet still, from the window, there came that sound, that gentle, patient tapping. They pause. In that pause, the fire shifts. A small shower of sparks flies up the chimney. The tree candles tremble, though no one has opened a door. The storyteller lets the silence linger just long enough for everyone in the room to feel the shape of the story settling around them like another invisible blanket. Then, very softly, they say, "In our next part, we shall see who or what stood outside that window, and why it chose Christmas Eve to knock." My friends, now we come to Chapter 4, The Visitor at the Window. In that little house at the edge of the village, the storyteller says softly, the Christmas Eve fire was burning low. Inside, a small family was doing much the same as we are now. In the chair by the hearth sat a woman in a dark dress, her hair pulled back neatly, her hands folded in her lap. She had lost her husband 2 winters before, and though she rarely mentioned it, she still sometimes turned towards his empty chair before she remembered that no one sat there now. On the rug before the fire sat her son, a boy of perhaps 10 years, with a serious face and bright, thoughtful eyes. He was old enough to understand more than she wished he would, and young enough to miss his father with a fierceness he did not quite have words for. Outside their walls, the storyteller continues, the fog lay thick over the lane that led to the churchyard. The tower was invisible. The gravestones were only shapes in the whitening mist, but the boy knew they were there. He had walked that path in summer with his father's hand around his own, and he had walked it again behind the slow-moving cart that carried the coffin 2 winters ago. Now, on this Christmas Eve, he sat very close to the fire, listening to the quiet crackle of the logs and wondering, in the private, secret way that children do, whether his father might somehow know that it was Christmas. In the house, the storyteller says, there were small signs of the season. A simple branch of holly stood in a jug on the table. A single orange waited to be shared in the morning. On the mantel, a candle burned beside a small picture of the man they both missed. The boy's mother stared at the fire with the expression of someone who is both tired and stubbornly hopeful. She had managed a special loaf of bread, a little piece of meat, and even that orange. She had told herself that this was enough. But as the house grew quiet and the shadows lengthened in the corners of the room, something in her heart longed for one more sign that they were not as alone as they sometimes felt. Outside, the storyteller says, the fog pressed closer to the window panes. The lane was empty. No more carol singers would come. No neighbor would brave that thick, clinging mist at such a late hour. And so, when the boy first heard the soft tapping at the window, he thought quite calmly that he must have imagined it. It was such a small sound, the storyteller continues. Not a knock, bold and ordinary, as a visitor would give, but a light, almost hesitant tap, as if something just beyond the glass had reached out a hand and then at the last moment was not quite sure it wished to be heard. The boy looked up, the storyteller says, and his eyes went first to the door. It was still bolted. The latch had not stirred. The narrow gap beneath it showed only darkness. Then he glanced towards his mother. She had heard nothing. Her gaze was still on the fire, caught in some thought he could not see. He might have let it go then, the storyteller says, had the sound not come again. Tap, tap. This time it was a little clearer, as if the fog itself had leaned closer to listen and carried the sound with it. The boy's skin prickled. He felt that strange mixture of fear and curiosity that comes when you know something is not quite right, but you are not yet certain it is wrong. "Mother?" he said quietly. She started, blinking as if waking from a dream, and turned her face towards him. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" she said. Even as she spoke, the sound came again. A light, careful tap against the glass. This time, the storyteller says, they both heard it. The mother's hands closed more tightly in her lap. For a heartbeat, she simply sat and listened, as if hoping the sound would prove to be nothing at all. But the tapping came again, soft, patient, impossible to ignore. The mother rose slowly from her chair. She was not a nervous woman. Widowhood, work, and worry had worn away whatever fluttering fears she might once have had. Still, as she crossed the room, she felt the hairs lift at the back of her neck. The boy watched her go, the firelight shining along the edge of her dark dress, until she reached a small window that faced the lane. "Stay where you are," she murmured, without turning her head. He did as he was told, but his eyes did not leave her back. At the window she laid one hand on the sill. The glass was cold. The wood beneath her fingers was slightly damp from the breath of the fog. Outside there was only whiteness, a soft, dense cloud pressed up against the house, erasing the lane, the hedge, and the familiar shapes of the neighboring fields. For a moment she saw nothing at all but her own faint reflection, a pale oval of a face, eyes darker than usual in the dim light. Then, as her eyes adjusted, another shape seemed to gather itself from the fog. It was not sharp, not the sort of thing you could sketch or measure. Just the suggestion of someone standing very still just beyond the glass. The outline of a shoulder, the tilt of a head, the impression of a face turned towards the light. For one heartbeat, the storyteller says quietly, her own heart forgot its work. Because that blurred figure, that vague, gathered shadow, stood at the very height and angle of the man she had said goodbye to 2 winters before. In the firelit parlor where our listening family sits, one of the children draws in a soft breath. The storyteller's voice remains gentle. She did not scream, they say. She did not run. She simply stood with her hand on the sill and looked back at the fog that seemed to be looking in. Then, they continue, she did something very small and very brave. She reached with her free hand for the candle on the nearby table, the one that burned beside her husband's picture. And she carried it carefully to the window. She set the candle on the narrow sill, between her own reflection and the shadow in the fog, so that its little flame burned like a star caught between worlds. "If you are truly there," she whispered, "then you will know what this means." In the room behind her, the boy could not hear the words, but he saw the small light lifted to the glass and felt a tingle run all the way down his arms. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, very gently, the fog shape seemed to incline its head. Not pressing closer, not demand an entry, but in a gesture almost like a nod. The mother's eyes filled, but she did not look away. "You are missed," she said under her breath, "but we are here, and we are trying to be all right." At that, the shape in the fog grew fainter. It did not drift away like smoke. It did not vanish with any suddenness. It simply seemed to loosen, as mist does when the sun comes out, until she saw nothing but the whiteness again, and her own face reflected on the glass above the little candle flame. The tapping did not come again. She stood there for a few heartbeats more, her hand still on the sill, the wood warming slowly beneath her skin. Then she took up the candle, kissed the tips of her fingers, and touched them lightly to the frame of her husband's picture before setting the light back beside it. She turned to her son. His eyes were wide, but he had not moved from the hearth. "It's all right," she said softly. "There is nothing to fear." She sat down beside him on the rug, closer to the fire than she usually chose to be, and put her arm around his shoulders. "Did someone come, Mother?" he asked quietly. She thought for a moment. "Someone who loves us," she answered, "and who wished to see that we had a little light." My friends, now we come to Chapter 5, Morning Light and Memories. In our story of the little house at the edge of the village, Christmas morning came at last. The fog had lifted. The world outside lay crisp and pale beneath a skin of frost. Smoke rose straight up from chimneys. The church tower stood clear against the sky, its bells ringing bright and over the fields. The boy and his mother stood together by the window, their breath faintly misting the glass as they looked down at the footprints below. A simple path pressed into the white, coming from the lane up to the house, and then stopping. They said little about it to anyone else. The neighbors heard only that they'd had a visitor of some kind in the night, and that nothing had been taken and no harm had been done. But for the boy and his mother, that quiet moment at the window, the prints, the empty space beyond them, and the candle they both knew had burned there, became part of the way they remembered that Christmas for the rest of their lives. Years passed. The boy grew older. He learned a trade, left the village for a time, came back again, and one day found himself in a parlor of his own. With a chair by the fire, a small tree in the corner, and children of his own sitting on the rug with bright, thoughtful eyes very much like his own. And on certain Christmas Eves, when the fog lay thick in the lane outside, he would tell them the story of the visitor at the window. He did not always say what he himself believed. Sometimes he spoke as if it were simply a curious tale, a mystery never quite solved. Sometimes his voice grew softer at the mention of the candle and the shadow in the fog. And his children, watching his face, understood that for him it had been something more. Sometimes his voice grew softer at the mention of the candle and the shadow in the fog. And his children, watching his face, understood that for him it had been something more. But however he told it, the story did what such stories are meant to do. It wrapped the small, warm room in a sense of being part of something larger. A pattern of love and loss, fear and comfort, darkness and light, that reaches back much farther than any one family or any one Christmas Eve. In our own little Victorian parlor now, the storyteller's voice falls quiet. The children on the rug release the breaths they didn't know they were holding. One of them glances almost shyly towards the window where the fog still presses against the glass. The mother in our listening family reaches down absently to smooth a child's hair. The father clears his throat once, as if he might speak, but does not. On the small table beside the storyteller's chair, the thin book lies closed once more. Whether the tale came from those printed pages or from somewhere older, a memory, a rumor, or perhaps a feeling, no one asks. The fire has burned lower. The tree candles are almost ready to be snuffed out for the night. Yet the room feels, in some quiet way, brighter than before. The gentle weight of a blanket over children's shoulders. And the knowledge, soft, not showy, that love once given does not quite go out. The storyteller looks around at the listening faces. Ghost stories at Christmas, they say at last, are not really about frightening ourselves. They are about remembering that life is fragile, time is precious, and that every person we sit beside in the light is a gift we do not have forever. Tonight we have warmed ourselves with a story of fog and a window, of a woman and a child, and of a presence that may or may not have come back for just one more look at the home it loved. Whether you think of it as a true visitation or as the kindness of memory given shape in the dark, may it remind you to hold gently to the people beside you now. In the parlor, someone gives a small, contented sigh. The storyteller smiles, a quiet, private smile that crinkles the corners of their eyes, and reaches out to stir the fire one last time. Now, they say softly, it is late. The ghosts have had their chance to speak. The night will keep its own watch outside our windows. And we, they add, glancing with affection at the faces around them, will keep one another warm until morning. The clock on the mantel ticks on. The fog presses gently at the glass. And somewhere in the long thread of time that links their Christmas Eve to ours, a small light still burns in a window. My dear listener, as our journey through the past gently comes to an end, allow the echoes of history to settle softly around you. These lives, these moments, and these forgotten worlds may be distant in time, but their stories still breathe in the quiet spaces between us. May the calm of this journey remain with you like candlelight, lingering long after the flame has dimmed. Wherever your path leads next, remember that history is never truly gone. It waits patiently to be listened to once more until our next quiet journey. Rest well, and may peace stay gently by your side.